Welcome to the AK Podcast, where we explore science and nutrition behind livestock care and management, the best and the brightest in the business. I'm your host, Chris Radke, part of the sales team here at Agri-King, and with me today, as usual, is the Director of Field Services and a member of the sales management team, Mr. Mike Donaldson. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Very well, Chris. How's everything going in your world?
Pretty good. It's a little dreary outside, but hope we'll warm things up with this wonderful conversation with Dr. Schauff. So you want to introduce him?
Absolutely. Well, Chris, there are a lot of different categories of nutrients when we're feeding ruminants. Often protein gets all the attention. I think largely because on a lot of farms, that's one of the biggest out-of-pocket expenses when it comes to feeding cattle. A lot of protein is bought instead of raised. But if you were to look at a diet, more money is spent on meeting an animal's energy needs than on their protein needs. It's just that a lot of that energy, especially if someone's growing their own corn grain, a lot of that energy comes off of their own farm and it somehow feels differently. Now, we did a previous podcast about the rumen, about the 4 compartments in a ruminant's stomach. And we want to start going a little deeper into the energy part of nutrition. But to begin, we want to deal with the aspect of fiber meeting a big part of those energy needs. And to do that today, we have Dr. Dan Schauff from the nutrition department at Agri-King. Dan's actually one of our longest tenured nutritionists at Agri-King. And he is going to take us through the role fiber can play in meeting a ruminant's energy needs. So, Dr. Schauff, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, Mike.
So, feel free to disagree with me if you like. But
all right,
what makes energy such an important part of nutrition that it's the one we want to address first when we start breaking this down?
Well, 3 things come to mind. First off, energy is really difficult to define what energy is. When you're talking about protein, you're talking about carbohydrates, they're made up of amino acids, and fat is made up of fatty acids, and you can analyze it and you can actually see it. But when energy is hard to define, it's the potential to do work. We don't actually measure it directly. When we look at energy in a feed or something, we're actually looking at heat production, which is indirect. But energy is very important. It's what moves things metabolically in the body of your and I's system. And so the combustion of things like carbohydrates and to a certain extent protein and fat is what drives metabolic reactions in the body. Things like we need energy for maintenance, right? So for things like digestion, absorption requires energy that's produced from the breakdown of carbohydrates and fats and energy yielding substrates. Respiratory function, immune function, for that animal to move around, to use its muscles, needs energy, which is part of that maintenance requirement. And then there's a huge requirement for growth and reproduction and milk production. So energy is just critical for life and critical for efficient production. Just to kind of give you an idea of how much energy a lactating dairy cow requires, you and I as adult males, we require about 2,000 kcals a day to meet our energy requirements for us to function, to live. If you take a 1,600-pound dairy cow producing 120 pounds of milk and 4+ milk fat and so forth, she requires about 12,000 kcals of energy each day just for maintenance, just to digest feed, to move around, chew or cud, breathe, for heart beating and so forth. That's 6 times what you and I need for energy. And then another 43,000 calories just for the milk production. So she requires 55,000 kcals a day, that 120 pound. So the requirement is just tremendous. And of course, fiber and different things are going to be part of that, meeting those energy requirements.
So a lactating dairy cow needs around the same amount of energy a day is the starting 11 people on a football team then, if I'm doing my math right?
You're right.
2,000?
Right.
Oh,
It's
wow.
Yep. It's a tremendous amount of energy. It just those dairy cows are just awesome machines that God made. It's just awesome.
Well, you mentioned the different, there's some different types of fiber. I'm sorry, there's some different types of energy. We want to deal with fiber today because that is the aspect that are monogastric, ourselves, pigs, chickens, don't really get a great deal of nutrient. Fiber is important, but we don't get a great deal of nutrition out of it. From your perspective, and maybe this goes into even starting to talk about the difference between the measurement of fiber, ADF versus NDF. What are the quote unquote best types of fiber in a dairy cow's diet? What are we going to get the most bang for our buck out of?
Sure. So maybe I'll just talk a little bit about what fiber is. ADF and NDF stands for acid detergent fiber, neutral detergent fiber. Those are the lab measurements that we've used for decades, and it's basically a measurement of the plant cell wall, or other known as fiber. So NDF encompasses what fiber is, and as you pointed out, Mike, non-ruminants, you and I, don't produce digestive enzymes to break down the fiber components. It's the bacteria that are in the rumen or the lower gut of the animal. Of course, we have a little bit of hindgut bacteria as humans too, so we have maybe a limited ability, but we don't have any natural enzymes to break down fiber, the components of fiber. We requires fiber digesting bacteria in the rumen and in their lower gut in order to utilize it. So basically what in regards to what are some of the important things in NDF that's important for the dairy cow, you got about 4 or 5 different components. Cellulose is one of the components of fiber. It's probably the majority of the fiber that's in NDF, and it has a certain degree. By itself, it has a pretty decent degree of digestibility. For example, the fuzz on cottonseed is almost 100% cellulose. The cotton clothes that we have is 100% cellulose. And it's made up of glucose units hooked together, but we don't have the ability to break it down. That's why we need that. And then the second aspect of NDF is lignin. And lignin, I kind of refer to lignin as kind of the rebar in cement. So the more rebar you put in cement, the stronger that cement wall is. And the same thing goes in forages. The more lignin that's in those forages, the stronger that plant is. The problem is lignin is not very digestible, and it makes the cellulose less digestible because it encrusts into the cellulose. So it's a component that makes it less digestible. And basically, as the plant gets more mature, lignin increases, digestibility goes down. And so that's why we want to try to avoid very mature forages because that's going to reduce digestibility. Now, the other things there's 2 other major components in NDF. One is hemicellulose. That's made up of 5 carbon sugars, xylose and arabinose. They're pretty digestible by themselves as long as they're not encrusted with lignin. And then pectin, which is a polysaccharide of glycuronic acid, and it's very digestible, about 90%. And basically in a young plant, the pectin is pretty high. We've got some pretty digestible cellulose. We've got pretty digestible hemicellulose. The lignin is not real high. And so we have good digestibility. But as the plant matures, the lignin goes up, the pectin goes down, and our digestibility and our energy that we can get from that forage goes down.
I know across the country where you farm, there can be vastly different approaches to where we're going to get good quality fiber. If you're in California, you might be feeding a lot of byproduct, almond hulls, pumice, things like that. If you're in Florida with that growing season, things are a little different. The Midwest is a touch different again. But I think universally, the first place we're going to look at fiber as a great source of nutrition will be from forages. So you're saying that the younger a plant is, the less lignin it's going to have. Is the example of the best you could get then a cow being out on fairly young pasture? I mean, would that be the gold standard of quality fiber from a forage?
Yes, I mean, immature, I mean, you can get some really young spring pasture, can be quite digestible. It's good. It's not going to provide everything that the cow needs. So you're still going to need to feed some things around it to complement those forages. But yeah, young pasture, immature alfalfa can be very, very digestible and provide a good portion of the energy for that animal needs.
When we're feeding a cow, and there's a number of things that we've got to be aware of, I understand, but is the what kind of a transition period do we need to allow for if we have to make a major change in forage type? How long does it take the rumen to adjust to that kind of a switch in forage or forage quality?
Well, it kind of depends on the degree of the difference in the forages and the feeds. I mean, if there's a dramatic change going from really good quality to really poor quality, then, it could take a couple weeks for that animal's rumen microbes to adjust to it. And then even then, we're going to have to feed some more commodities and things around it to make up for what we don't have in that poor quality forages.
I do think Agri-King focuses awfully hard on helping someone get good quality forages and then getting the most use out of it. There seems to also be in the industry the opinion, well, we've got grain, we can take any quality forage and put enough nutrients in it to get the production, the components that a farm might be looking for. What do you see as the weakness in that approach where we don't emphasize forage quality and we just essentially feed them barely better than straw, but add enough grain to get the nutrients that she needs?
Okay. Well, a couple things come to mind. Number one, and you might have alluded to it earlier, that whenever we're feeding poor to average quality forages, in order to meet that 55,000 kcals, right? And if we don't get it from the forages, then we have to get it from the grains, we get it from commodities, from protein sources, from fat sources, and so forth. And so, generally speaking, the ration costs are going to be greater. So that's one thing. Not always, but a lot of times the cost of that ration is going to be greater when we have poor quality forages versus much better quality forages because we don't have to feed as much. And especially purchase feed costs, the cost for protein, the cost for protected fat, and other commodities and stuff. So the ration costs more typically with lesser quality forage. So that's one argument against it. The second argument is that you just oftentimes can't quite duplicate the level of performance with poor quality forages, and making up for it was, like soy hulls and corn and protein sources and fat and so forth. You can get more milk production versus not making the adjustments at all, but you just can't duplicate the same level of performance, the same level of production, the same level of component efficiency with poor quality forages that you can with good quality forages. And some of the reasons why that is that when you're feeding, less quality forages, a lot of times we have to push the grain levels higher to meet energy requirements. As I mentioned, the problem with feeding more and more starch to meet the requirement is that after a meal, the cows, that starch is being fermented so quickly that it's producing acids very quickly, and it drops the pH. The fiber bugs do not like low rumen pHs. Much below 6 for a very long period of time is going to knock back your cellulite population. So then you're actually going to reduce even further the digestibility of the fiber. So what fiber is there is less digestible, but then when we add corn, it tends to put pressure on the whole buffering system. And so they actually get less out of the forages, and so then they don't get as much. It also makes it hard to maintain milk fat, that sort of thing. the other thing too is when the animals are exposed to long bouts or chronic situations of feeding a lot of corn to try to balance the diet, and so that puts pressure on the whole buffering system. Eventually, it's going to have a negative effect on the rumen epithelium, the rumen wall, on the intestinal wall, and that can cause negative effects on absorption. So you got to break things down. We got to get things absorbed, and if you damage the rumen wall, you damage the intestinal wall, then our absorption deficiency goes down. So all those things are going to prevent us from getting that performance. Plus, we're going to have probably more health problems. Then there's going to be expenses incurred with that. And then, there's a lot of talk in recent years about leaky gut syndrome, right? When you have any kind of inflammation or stress, whether it be mycotoxins, whether it be feeding too much corn, you get what you call leaky gut. And where bacteria that can infiltrate in the bloodstream, and then the cow's response is inflammation. And that immune system is activated, and it requires a lot of energy for that to fight that immune challenge. There's been studies that have been done where they estimate that whenever a cow is trying to, there's an inflammation event, could be heat stress, could be caused by mycotoxins, could be caused by too much starch with a little bit of acidosis, that steals about 1,000 grams of glucose a day that would have went for milk production, but it increases the maintenance requirement because the immune system is activated, and it's a hog of glucose. And so then that takes energy away from milk production. That can be 5 to 10 pounds of milk that we don't get because of all this chronic infection. And then that, of course, that leads to, poor animal health, and longevity goes down the tubes. So there's so many things, probably covered too many things, but.
No, but you are putting a nice exclamation point on why we started with fiber, because, it's easy to forget what an important foundation that sets for everything else. So I've got a farm, and as we record this, it's the middle of winter, so I've got the forages that I've got. Great quality, average quality, whatever it is that I have. You mentioned earlier that there are some non-forage sources of fiber, and you also mentioned the danger of trying to overuse starch to get that energy that the cow isn't getting from forage. First, what are some, you mentioned soy hulls, but go back again, please. List what some of the common good sources of fiber are from non-forage. And then secondly, we'll talk about working them in and how to use them, but not overuse them. But what are some of the things that you typically see go across your desk as other sources of fiber in a diet?
Sure. So, especially when we're dealing with average or lesser fiber digesting forages and stuff, like as I mentioned before, there's only so much starch you can feed before you start having some problems with rumen health. And so one of the roles of a non-forage fiber source is to provide a non-starch source of energy. And that provides the digestible starch. I mentioned that immature forages tend to be higher in pectin, especially alfalfa, which is very digestible. And things like citrus pulp, if you're down south, or soy hulls in the Midwest, usually are pretty good sources of pectin, which is very digestible. So it can kind of complement a poor quality forage, right? So it provides, plus the NDF is very digestible too. There's very little lignin in it. So there's very little that's going to prevent it from being digested in the rumen. So they can be a good way of getting energy in there if we don't quite have it from the forages. Now, the problem is we can only feed so much soy hulls because even though it's a very good source of digestible fiber, it's a very poor source of effective fiber. And so, you still need that forage there to form a good rumen mat to stimulate cud chewing and buffering and all that kind of stuff. That's important for digestibility, but it can be there. So citrus pulp soy hulls, I think of them as a very digestible fiber source. Out in California, almond hulls, they can be a digestible fiber source. They actually are a fairly effective fiber source because they have some length to it. But it's usually not quite as the quality of fiber as like soy hulls and citrus pulp would provide. Another good source of non-forage fiber is cottonseed. And it's, like I said, the fuzz is pretty much all or cellulose, and it's got it's not as probably digestible fiber as soy hulls, but it's got a decent amount of fiber digestibility, and it also has some degree of effective fiber too. So it's when we need some digestible fiber, plus we also need to maybe stretch our forage supply a little bit because we're short on inventory, we can use cottonseed and soy hulls to a certain extent to extend our forages a little bit. The other benefit of cottonseed is it's also got protein. It's also got oil and fats. So it's a really good all around. It provides, protein, fat, and fiber. It's a nice product to be used, whether it's good quality forages or even poor quality forages. Cottonseed is a nice fit there because it provides a lot of different things: protein, energy, and digestible fiber. And then sometimes, in the Midwest, distillers, corn gluten feed is readily available and economical. It's not what I would call an ultimate fiber source, but it has some decent fiber digestibility too. So we can use distillers, we can use corn gluten feed, that sort of thing to kind of fill in if we're limited either on supply of forage or we're limited on quality forage.
So some of those feeds being able to bring in more than one nutrient and affect the balance of the ration. I've seen, in fact, we have a client in the thumb of Michigan right now that got an incredible deal on wet beet pulp. And you guys have gone ahead and set a ration up that probably walks that a little closer to the line, but he's got a great supply of forages. But while he can get this beet pulp, he is going to try to maximize the use of it strictly from a dollars and cents standpoint. What are but you got to watch if you're going to do this type of things that can come in when you start trying to force a non-forage source of fiber in because it's a good buy?
Well, probably the biggest thing, and I should mention that beet pulp is also an excellent source of pectin. It's very much like, I failed to mention that, so I'm glad you brought that up. Beet pulp is a tremendous, it's a good source of pectin, very digestible fiber. It can be excellent in that standpoint. The biggest limitation, as I mentioned before, with soy hulls and beet pulp and citrus pulp is that they're not a very effective fiber source. So a dairy cow requires a certain amount of effective fiber. So that's why we have that Penn State separator where you have the top sieve. It's catches fiber that's like 3/4 to an inch in length. You need a certain amount of that in the diet. And some of these soy hulls, beet pulp are not going to provide that. And the reason why that's important because if we don't need too much, but just enough, maybe 5% of the fiber being in that long length, it stimulates cud chewing, and then cud chewing produces saliva, which produces buffering, and that helps to balance the rumen. So that's an important aspect of it. And things like soy hulls and things like citrus pulp or beet pulp are not going to provide that cud chewing scratch factor. The other thing is you need a certain amount of length. You need an inch, you maybe need a half inch, a third of an inch forage particles to form a rumen mat. We talk about it a lot of times. They talk about a rumen mat, and that can be hard to describe, but it's kind of like a net that holds the finer particles in the rumen so they can get digested, like the corn, the soybean meal, that kind of stuff. Otherwise, if we didn't have that mat there, things would flow out of the rumen before we want it to. We lose digestibility and that sort of thing. And so if we just add more and more soy hulls, that rumen mat can get soft. And we get too fast passage rate, and we have problems with maybe butterfat sometimes. We have lack of cud chewing, poor digestibility, and that sort of thing. So there's a limit on how much you can feed of that.
Okay. Any closing thoughts on how you've seen the importance of fiber shift maybe in your experience as a nutritionist, or are we looking at some things differently than we did 10 or 15 years ago?
I don't know. I guess when I first came to Agri-King, we oftentimes emphasize the importance of forage quality to whenever we can feed cows more good quality forages, we don't have to rely on on as much commodity, so it lowers feed costs. That's kind of been thing that we have promoted for a number of years, and I think it's even more important today than it was even 30 years ago when I first came to Agri-King. And the reason I say that is that in the U.S. we don't consume a lot of fluid milk, but we consume a lot of solids. We consume a lot of cheese. We consume a lot of things like yogurt and that sort of thing. And so the value of milk fat and that sort of thing and components have been very, very important. And the genetics are moving more towards components. And so it's going to be more and more important to have a good foundation of good quality forages, because when we get a fermentation, a breakdown of some good quality forages, we get things like acetate and butyrate produced. Those are crucial for milk fatty acid synthesis. If we're going to realize the genetic potential of that dairy cow, we want to make sure we have a good foundation of good quality forages, digestible forages. And if we have good digestible forages, we don't have to feed as much starch, so we have a healthier rumen, and then we have better fiber digestibility because we have a healthier rumen, and then we got more milk fat. It kind of feeds on that. And then we still have to feed the animals some grain, and still need to feed them things like sugars and stuff, and fat, and all those things are still important to that. But the better the quality of the forage, we don't have to rely as much on that, and we're going to more apt to realize the full genetic capability of that dairy cow that we're feeding today, to try to really feed for pounds of components, milk fat, milk protein, and those sorts of things, that I think is going to be very important. The other thing is, I think we're learning more and more all the time, is that the benefits of a healthy microbiome. So microbiome, that's all the bacteria and stuff that are in the rumen and the gut of the animal. And one of the things that we're finding is that the microbiome has a huge impact on the health of the rumen wall, health of the intestinal wall, the health of the animal. And one of the things that I went to a conference a few months ago, it was a ruminant conference in Chicago, and a rumen microbiologist by the name of Todd Calloway from the University of Georgia, he kind of made a comment that kind of stuck with me. And he was saying basically a healthy microbiome and forage quality is very important to that. A healthy microbiome is one of the best shock absorbers against stress. And so cows have to undergo all kinds of stress in today's environment. When you talk about, like you mentioned before, feed changes causes stress. If you have a healthy microbiome, those cows are going to go through that feed change a lot smoother. If you've got heat stress, if you have a healthy microbiome, they're going to endure the heat stress better. Mycotoxins, that's something that we deal with more and more. And if we have a healthy microbiome, that's going to do. And then, of course, the big thing right now is bird flu, right? And we're finding out that the cows that have the healthier cows to start with, healthy rumens, they tend to have less issues with the bird flu. The duration of it is shorter in herds. So they're just, and then if we have a foundation of a healthy rumen, it's just going to mean that we're going to have a cow that's going to stay in the herd that much longer. We don't have to color roof where we want to. We can get more production out of her and milk component efficiency. So
that sounds like it's as simple as saying, well, they are ruminants, they can digest fiber. Let's embrace that and get the most out of it that we can, and a lot of other things just go along with that.
Yep, we just need to complement that really good quality forages to optimize things.
Dan, thank you so much for being with us today. Very illuminating. Chris, what'd you learn?
Hey, I learned that number 55,000. That is a huge number, and I think Mike referenced a football team. So, just your whole talk about as a football team, they can't eat just junk food if they're going to perform properly. So, thank you, Dr. Schauff, for illuminating that for us. If you like what you heard, you like what we were talking about, hit us up on any of our socials. If you have any questions or concerns, or something you'd like us to talk about more, you can send us an email at podcasts@agriking.com. All right, Dr. Schauff, Mike, thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.